Welcome back to the FHIR and 5. We're up to the letter T, and I thought it'd be really important to cover off terminology and what it means in a FHIR context. There's a lot of terminology used within FHIR, and if you think about the types of terminologies, I mean, you're automatically drawn to things like SNOMED CT, SNOMED CT-AU in Australia, for things like diagnosis, procedures, allergies, and even medications in an AMT perspective. But also things like status codes, terminologies that are used within FHIR, sex codes, marital status codes. So lots of different coding used within FHIR, and we just need to think about how we look at coding within FHIR and how those are managed. An important concept when we consider terminology is the value set, and the value set is a list of codes that are valid for a particular element within FHIR. So it might be a list of allergy codes that we want to capture, and we might say that the value set's being drawn from a coding system called SNOMED CT or SNOMED CT-AU, and we want to bring out all of those that are allergy related codes and make those available and bind that to this particular field within the allergy intolerance resource. So there's a few things here. So there's binding, so the value set's bound to a particular element, and we have a binding strength. And so the binding strength might be example, it might be required. So depending on that binding strength, we'll say whether the values need to come from a particular value set or different value sets, and whether you can extend those value sets. So if we're talking about the binding strength of the patient's sex, you know, it has a set of defined values, and you can't change those. It's a required binding strength, whereas others might be an example binding strength. There's two forms of value sets. One's extensional, and extensional is basically we're saying these are the list of codes that we want to use within our value set, and we're being very explicit around the codes that we want. The second is intentional, so we can derive a set of codes based on some criteria. So it might be that, you know, we're saying anything with the description that contains the word diabetic or diabetes we want in that particular value set. So working with terminologies, you'll often come across terminology servers, or maybe your FHIR server that you're working with has terminology services inbuilt in it. There's a number of different operations that we can perform on those terminologies that are really useful in dealing with them. And depending on how we're interacting with the FHIR server, you know, if we're using a client-side application that we want to go off and get a list of codes so that we can validate that information before we try and write it to the FHIR server, you know, you'll use one or more of these particular operations. So the first one is expand. So we can ask for an expanded list of codes within a value set, and we can do further filtering on that data to get the information that we need directly from the FHIR server or terminology server. The lookup operation, or $lookup, can look up a particular code in a coding system to see whether this particular code is valid in that coding system. So really useful if you're doing some sort of searching within your application and you're asking for certain criteria, and you're going to look it up against the FHIR server to see whether that thing's valid or not. Validate code, so I can check to see whether this particular code is in the value set that I'm asking for. So especially useful when you might have a SNOMED term that you know is a valid SNOMED term, but you don't know whether that SNOMED term actually exists in the value set that you're trying to use. So remember that your value set's bound to a particular element. So it might be my allergy code or allergen code, and I want to make sure that the code that I've selected is actually part of that value set before I start using it. So $translate is another operation that's popular in the terminology space, and allows us to translate codes from one coding system to another, or one value set to another. Normally used to translate things from, say, SNOMED CT AU to LOINC or vice versa. There are concept maps that have those mappings in them. So it's using those concept maps to define the relationship between one code and another. So whether you're using an inbuilt terminology service as part of your FHIR server, or you've got a dedicated terminology service, hopefully you can use some of those operations that we spoke about to interact with your terminology server. There's a really great terminology server used in Australia and the UK, the Onto server provided by the CSIRO in Australia. It's a great product and application to manage your terminologies. So certainly reach out to the CSIRO around how you can utilize their terminology server as part of your implementation, and have a look at those operations to see how you can best use your terminology server to get the most out of it.